This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I'm almost 500 episodes in, and I never cease being surprised as to great insights that come from my guest. My guest today is Chris Voss. His newest work, Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as if your life depended on it. He is a former international hostage negotiator for the FBI. What an amazing career, what amazing experience, and what awesome insights he can offer all of us. We actually started this interview twice. The first interview, Chris's voice went bad, lost his voice. But there was some great content in that 15 to 20 minutes before he lost his voice. This is actually two parts. The first part of this interview, the longest part, is our second interview. On the back end, I include some bonus material from our first interview. Awesome stuff. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Chris Voss. Chris, I want you to go back in time to when you were a lead negotiator for kidnappings in the FBI. Pretend, and I don't know how to do this because I've never kidnapped anybody, I've never done something like this, but pretend for the moment that I have secured some wealthy businessman's daughter and I am saying I need $1 million within 24 hours. You have reasonable belief that I'm serious. You have reasonable belief that there should be some concern. Out of the gate, how do you initially, what starts to go through your head, and how do you approach when you first make contact with me? How do you approach that situation right out of the gate? I think if people can get into your mind at this very initial phase, I think it could be really interesting and useful.
Once I had done it enough that I really understood it, I understood the guy on the other side. I know what you need to feel in order so that you'll relax and let me slip gently into the driver's seat. I know that you need to feel that you're going to accomplish your goals, and what you lust for more than anything else is money. I mean, the harder anybody demands anything, and a kidnapper is demanding extremely hard, then that means that's the harder they want it, which really means I've got the leverage if I don't fight you for power. The minute I make you feel in control, large, and in charge, and then I take a deferential approach, I start to get the upper hand on you, and you're blind to it because you're driving for control.
Okay, but I have the control right now. I've got the girl. I need the money from you. You don't have any control. You're just a guy talking to me on the phone, Mr. FBI.
Yeah, how many people in the world are you going to sell that girl to?
Well, that starts to be the process right there.
Yeah, and I'm not going to say that out and out because I know that this is a buyer's market. There is one buyer on the entire planet. And since I know that, then, really I've got you. You can't go anywhere else. If you don't make a deal with me, then you don't make a deal. And you put too much in time investment into this. You put a massive, you're all the way in here. You got nowhere else to go. So if I know all that, then I just have to covertly take advantage of that in the negotiation. And I know that you're driving for control. And I know that you've done this so many times that you feel like as soon as I'm afraid that you feel in control. You've got one move. You got one approach with me. And it's like any other control-oriented negotiator. You let a control-oriented negotiator feel in control and they drop their guard. So I know what's going on behind the scenes with you emotionally, and I'm just willing to accept that and play it.
It is truly fascinating. And I think people can just hear that initial little story with us and they can start to imagine that type of thinking, you taking yourself the best that you can as the person on the other side dealing with the terrorist or kidnapper, that you taking your emotion out of it and you looking at it essentially as a game. How do you play the game best to get the objective that you want, correct?
Yeah, it is, and it's I like to think of it as sort of like spring-loaded chess, because a lot of people want to think of negotiations as chess, which is move, counter move, and very complicated. But first of all, negotiation isn't move, counter move. I may make 3-4 moves in a row. I may want you to make 3-4 moves in a row, and then of course every move that I make, since Herb Cohen said a long time ago that negotiation is influence within a web of tension. The web of tension is emotions and what we want, which means that all the pieces are spring-loaded with this tension of emotion. And every time a piece moves, all the other pieces on the board move a little bit too, which is why you can't think, in a chess game, you can think 14 moves ahead. In negotiation, you can really only think about 3 or 4 moves ahead, and then the whole board resets, and you have to rethink your goals. And when you get comfortable with that, then actually you are now playing at a much higher level than the person on the other side is.
Let's go back in time a little bit. I want the audience to understand some of your background. You go into the FBI what year?
1983.
Go back to 1983. So you're just getting out of college, you go directly to the FBI. What was motivating you to go into the FBI?
No, I've been a cop, street cop, uniformed police officer, Kansas City, Missouri, for about 3 years. I loved being a cop. It was challenging. It was an opportunity to be very creative and be very innovative and do good at the same time. I have to admit, I liked doing good. I always have. And I'd really enjoyed it, but then I'd, gotten a bug of federal law enforcement in my head, and the opportunity to maybe travel around the world. And I am a small town Iowa boy, and I had never been to Mexico, and I'd kind of seen Canada. The prospect of international travel really intrigued me, and that's why I looked at federal law enforcement. And I was very lucky that the FBI was hiring a bunch of people by the time I put in my application, and I kind of got in with the crowd.
So I could go down many data points, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but you're in the FBI. You eventually get yourself to a place where you are one of the lead international, if not lead, international kidnapping negotiator for the Bureau. How did that happen? What was the impetus? How did the negotiation inside the FBI get you to that place?
It was a combination of my terrorism time in New York City. I was on a joint terrorist task force in New York, worked with some fantastic guys, was lucky enough to put together some great cases. Actually, myself and my partners, we won the Attorney General's Award for Excellence in Law Enforcement, which is, it was a great honor. It's kind of a pinnacle thing. There are about 3 FBI agents every year that get it. Not very many people get it at all. And so I had a lot of terrorism experience, and I'd become a hostage negotiator. And again, I got lucky. I negotiated a bank robbery with hostages, which is a really rare event. It happens in the movies all the time. In real life, it happens in the United States about once every 20 years.
What's the old Al Pacino movie?
When I did the bank robbery in Brooklyn, it was actually 20 years since the Al Pacino movie Dog Day Afternoon had taken place, and they referenced it because it had been that long since something like that had happened in New York City. So yeah, it was the same kind of thing, only we talked everybody out. Nobody got shot, nobody got killed, and the first bank robber to surrender actually surrendered to me personally outside the bank.
When he surrendered to you, was he relieved?
He was. He came outside. He followed the instructions of the SWAT guys to the T, so he didn't get hurt. And he didn't see me right away. And when he came out, he actually looked around and said, "Where's Chris?" Because, he was looking for me. He was listening to my voice. He only knew me by my voice. And he wanted me to walk up, and he was looking forward to meeting me, because he took his life in his own hands when he went in the bank, and he took his life in his own hands when he came out, and he put his life in my hands. And so, he was relieved. He was happy to be out of it.
And was that your first big kind of experience where you started to build a foundation of what was going to become a career in this?
I'd been trained as a hostage negotiator a little more than a year earlier, and I'd spent a lot of time on a suicide hotline, which is pretty much the same thing. A crisis hotline, suicide hotline is the same thing as hostage negotiation. There's just no SWAT team. So by the time I got into the real deal, I really felt like I understood the process and I knew what I was doing. But this was the first real big event that I was ever involved in. Yeah.
Let's jump ahead a little bit more. We're going to kind of backfill on some cases and ideas and examples. But where did you eventually leave the FBI? And I think the number that I saw is you were involved in over 150 cases, kidnapping cases. I mean, it's with that type of a unique experience, it's sometimes got to be an unusual thing where you realize there's not a lot of peers that you can kind of share notes with. I mean, it's not a lot of people that have that particular experience set. How did you start to understand and make the jump to where all of this experience you had built up inside law enforcement, inside the Bureau, a fairly niche skill set, which maybe you always knew it had wider applicability, maybe you didn't. But when did you start to realize that this niche skill set really wasn't so niche and it was applicable well beyond what you had been trained in?
Well, the seeds of it really started when I first started on the crisis hotline, because that stuff was so effective with people in crisis. I thought this has to work in daily life and business life. And so I started.
Give an example right there. When you say you're on the crisis hotline, think back to an example that you could give some color where you're on a call, that you can't see the person, they can't see you, and you walk someone down. Does anything come to mind for you?
Yeah, well, there was one call in particular. This guy calls up one night, and he says, "Hey, look, I need help putting a lid on the day. I got to put a lid on the day." And I heard frantic in his voice. And at that time, we did something called reflection. Now, in business terms, I call it a label. And I heard a negative driver, and I said, "You sound frantic. It's that simple." And science now backs it up. You simply identify a negative driver, a negative emotional driver in somebody, and it diminishes it. And as soon as I say, "You sound frantic" to this guy, I feel his voice strengthen, and I feel him calm down in our subsequent conversation. Instantly, I feel the change. And I now know that the electrical activity in his brain diminished the moment he heard me say that. And so then he begins to talk to me. He's struggling with a problem. He's paranoid, and he's going to go on a car trip the following day with his family. And he knows that on the car trip, his paranoia is going to make him a basket case. So thinking about it now the night before, he's becoming a basket case, thinking about being a basket case. He's telling me about how hard his family is helping him work through this problem. And it occurs to me, his family sounds very close. They're very supportive. And I can remember in a previous conversation, in a personal interaction, describing my family to a friend. The friend at the time said to me, "Your family sounds really close." And the moment he said that to me, it felt so good. I mean, it felt so good. It was like a physical, chemical change. I reacted so positively to it. And so I said the same thing to this guy. I said, "It sounds like your family's really close." And bang, I could feel him strengthen, which is, again, to tie it into business. I do the same thing in business. If somebody's really driven by their company, I say, "Well, it sounds to me like your mission, your purpose here is really important to you." People love that, and they move towards you when you do that. So I said, "Sounds like your family's really close." And bang, a whole bunch more strength came into his voice. So now, with a very much more lucid and clear tone of voice, he's outlining all the things that he's doing to beat paranoia. And the culmination of this effort, to me, he sounded like a very determined guy. So I just said that. I said, "You sound really determined." And he goes, and he says it just like this. He says, "Yeah." He says, "I am determined. And you know what? I'm going to go on that car trip tomorrow, and I'll be fine. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me." And he hangs up. And all I did was say three things, but I hit three, two distinctive portions of his amygdala, which is where all our emotions go through our brain. And I diminished one, and I strengthened two others, and he moved. And the conversation didn't take 5 minutes. And he moved in a very positive direction. And that night was so powerful. And between all the training I've done in hostage negotiation, everything I've learned since, and then actually these days, when they have brain scientists that do an MRI of our brain and then wire us up to see where the electrical activity, I now know that this is science-based application of tactical emotional intelligence. And it took me a really long time and a lot of experimentation to get it to this point. But then, so I go through my bureau career trying to figure this out. I'm the lead international kidnapping negotiator. We got a kidnapping that didn't turn out the way I expected. And I knew we did everything we knew how to do, flash forward another 20 years. And so then I just wanted to go outside hostage negotiation. I went to Harvard Law School to study with them. And those guys were like, look, until you realize it, we already see it. What you're doing is the same thing we're doing. You're just doing it with different stakes. And from that point forward, as I got ready to leave the Bureau, then I was absolutely determined that this stuff works in business.
Let's talk about some of the key architects behind negotiation, at least in your world, and how you've synthesized your technique. Two names come to mind that I'm familiar with, that you're familiar with, Bill Urey and Daniel Kahneman. Why don't you talk about each for a moment, the influence they had on you and how they connect together? I think you know this as well, too. I've had both of them on my podcast, both very interesting guys, clearly two of the top minds. But why don't you speak to both of them and how that's kind of worked into your life and your technique?
Well, yeah, getting to Bill Urey, Roger Fisher, and everything that they brought through in a Harvard program on negotiation. I mean, laying out a very intellectual, rational structure for the entire negotiation process. Probably intellectually unassailable. I mean, they lay this stuff out and they put together such a framework so that anybody that goes deep into negotiation to try to understand the dynamics is benefited by reading anything that Bill Urey has written and understanding how the structure should work among rational human beings. Danny Kahneman, on the other hand, helped us understand that there's no such thing as rational human beings. And that's when we went away really in the negotiation world from game theory. And even to this day, if somebody wants, if I were to say I was going to teach a game theory in negotiation, everybody would sign up because we were like, how do I outsmart the other guy? How do I outplay him in chess? And they've gone away from game theory to behavioral, psychological, economic behavior. And how do people really tick? And boy, Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, hit it on the head with prospect theory. And reading anything by either of these guys, I'm such a huge fan because not only did they discover great stuff about people's fear of loss and what really drives us, and that we're more likely to take a risk to avoid a loss than we are to take a risk to accomplish a gain. Plus, when Danny Kahneman talks about the development, they had so much fun working together. And they thoroughly enjoyed the process. And even though they were scientists, they would bounce stuff off their family and friends. And they're not ashamed to admit that they were constantly having fun, learning with each other, and they felt better about life working together. And hearing Kahneman talk about that is inspiring to me, let alone what he brought to our understanding of how human beings tick. And I kind of mashed those things together with my hostage negotiation experience and have come up with this framework. I think we've got some new ideas that nobody ever talked about before, and I'm a practical application guy, and you give me an idea, let's see if it works. And our percentages of success are pretty high with this stuff.
Let's take a step back to the idea of negotiation. Most people don't really like negotiation. I'll share a quick one with you one time. I'll throw these numbers out because they're real. I'm not trying to impress anybody. It just happened, whatever, this is life. And I was jogging near a house that I owned in Vienna, Virginia. And there was a guy in the house right next door to me. I kind of thought about buying just for strategic reasons, for development reasons. And I was jogging by and the guy was raking leaves. It turned out he was a CIA agent in a past life. So I started negotiating with kind of an interesting character. But I immediately said to him as I'm jogging, I never really stopped. I said, hey, is your house house for sale? And he said, sure, how much? And I said, well, how about 800? And he said, and I never stopped joking. And he said, I said about 800. And he said, how about $1 million? And I said, how about if we split the difference? And he said, deal. He said, deal. And we walked over and shook hands. And that was the sum total negotiation right there. I mean, that's a lucky one. But talk about negotiation, because most people have, I mean, first off, life is negotiation, right? But most people have a big fear and aversion to negotiation. If you can get, and I hope people can already see this in our conversation in the first 20 minutes, if you can start to get over the hurdle and look at it, as you mentioned, scientifically, Yuri Kahneman, boy, there's a real advantage in life if you can just put the fear aside, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely, and this fear really drives us away from a process that could be tremendously productive. Because most of the time we think we're gonna face Donald Trump, and that it's going to be combative. I mean, everybody imagines our counterpart being that guy, and that it's going to be painful. Or if you come to a deal really quickly, and I walk away going like, I could have done better. I could have got more. So we're really hard on ourselves. I mean, I call this, you go to your holodeck, if you will, and in Star Trek, the holodeck was a room on the Starship Enterprise where you could go and create whatever reality you wanted to. And our holodeck kind of gets away from us sometimes. But if you can get to the point where you actually enjoy the process, and the first thing really is don't take yourself hostage. And we take ourselves hostage by feeling like we have to make a deal. So if you can walk away from any interaction, if you don't like it, then that frees you up to enjoy the process and make a big difference. It makes a big difference in what you could come up with. And the only way to get to that point is to do it enough times in small stakes negotiations. So you kind of get good at it. You kind of enjoy it. You turn it into an opportunity like, look, if we don't make a deal, at least you and I had fun talking to each other.
Yeah.
And then it changes. Then you can take the fear out of it. We don't beat ourselves up as much, and you get more out of life.
A slight sidetrack for a moment. This just popped into my head because I had this note written down, and I want to kind of get back into, for a moment before we get back into the business realm, going back in your experience. I've got this great line in front of me that it says, have you ever tried to devise a mutually beneficial win-win solution with a guy who thinks he's the Messiah? Now, so I mean, I love that, because most of life, you're really not dealing with, the Hail Bop tennis shoe guys or the maniacs that are flying planes into buildings that want to find virgins up in the sky. Most of the time, people are really not that crazy. However, how in your past life did your world unfold when you were dealing with, and I'm sure at some point in time, you probably dealt with someone, maybe not, that really did think they were the Messiah, figuratively. How does that situation go down? Even though it's probably more rare, how does that go down for handling that particular situation when they're just, frankly, batshit crazy?
Yeah, well, even batshit crazy has patterns, which was, I was on Comedy Central a couple years ago when the government was shut down. There was a sequester, and the government just completely shut down, and everybody in politics was saying, they're trying to take us hostage. And Comedy Central thought it was funny, and they put me on with Jason Jones, and we actually did. They said, all right, so let's walk through this once. We won't give you any scripted lines, and you just answer how you normally would. And they literally said to me, what do you do when you're dealing with somebody who's batshit crazy? And I said, even batshit crazy has its patterns, and people that we think are batshit crazy, they have delusions that they're God's gift to the planet, and they're really frustrated that the rest of the planet doesn't see it that way. And that's, it's called an extreme politician. So if you're on the left, that's called somebody from the Tea Party. If you're on your right, you call that person a Bernie Sanders supporter. Whatever your perspective is. And when I said that to them, they go like, wow, we don't have to script anything for you. This is actually the way the world really works. And they didn't script a thing for me. We just did it all off what I would normally say. So unless somebody's actually hearing voices, everybody has a desire for grandeur. It's just how badly we're infected by it. As soon as I start looking at your patterns and then I will go with your patterns, and you become very predictable to me. And as long as you're not actually hearing voices, and there aren't that many people out there that are, then your emotions, no matter how out of phase they might be with mine, I can still influence those emotions. And that's what I do with the same stuff from the hotline. You know, you sound frantic, you sound determined. That stuff works.
I'm thinking about a really horrible incident that, of course, everyone knows and recalls. But if I think to 9/11, the effective part of their strategy, perhaps, was that they walled themselves off, really, from any potential communication from somebody like you.
Yeah, that was the first thing, and had I had the opportunity to become engaged in that at the time, I would have said to our commanders, since these guys won't talk to us, this is a very bad sign. Like, if we could have got on the radio and raised those planes before we knew where they were going, they would not have responded. And that is the number one first indicator of danger, when they won't open themselves up to you at all. And so, yeah, they walled themselves off. And a lot of things that a lot of people don't know about that is the recruiters that put those guys into place, they had, I think, 18 protocols that they had to follow before they got on those planes and did what they were going to do. And 17 of those 18 were to keep them psychologically in line, because they were so afraid those guys were going to chicken out at the last moment and not do it. And that to me, that speaks to how this is all a game of psychology and influencing people's behavior through their emotions. And even the bad guys on the other side that we think are utterly determined to die, their recruiters are not so sure that they are, and that's how hard they work on these guys to make sure that they follow through.
When you start to look at it that way, it just it opens up a Pandora's box of how there's applicability in our own life. And I guess if I look at that example where you say, well, you didn't have the opportunity to communicate, they didn't want to communicate. Well, let's look at that in a business sense.
Right.
I can think back to an early business venture that I had, and, you know, there was no communication. He would not communicate. And so it didn't surprise me that when a crazy Looney Tunes lawsuit showed up at my attorney's doorstep, it really didn't surprise me because he didn't communicate.
Right. Yeah, there you go. Right. You had a gut instinct that there was something was wrong here. A lot of what I do is, all right, let's take your gut instinct and the things that are the little voice in your head that's telling you that something is wrong here. Now, is there a strategy that we can engage to maybe kickstart this in an unexpected way? And that's actually one of the things that I think, you know, in my book and in our approach, because a number of people have contributed to my philosophy. So I hate, you know, the I, me, my all the time. So many people have helped me learn this stuff. If you've got somebody who's silent on the other side, and you send them an email, one-line email that says, have you given up on resolving this amicably? 999 times out of 1,000, not quite 1,000% of the time, but since they can say no to that and not commit themselves to anything, they'll respond. Have
you given up on resolving this amicably? Just that simple question. So, okay, take a step back. You're a guy that's got a decent handle on emotions, psychology, etc. What is that triggering? You know, you're sitting there at your desk, you're already worked up, and the person that's your adversary, essentially, is sending you that email. And what does it cause inside the human condition to feel?
All right, so when we say no, we protect ourselves. So having protected yourself, you immediately relax and you kind of center yourself. And so then that in and of itself, you're a little more open to listening because it calms you down. Saying no calms people down. It makes them say, like, all right, I've already protected myself. It's okay to proceed. Now, the other thing this does is it also triggers the thing that Danny Kahneman was talking about. In the fear of loss drives people. Saying that you've given up on something, to say yes to that is to possibly open up yourself to loss, which we don't like. So again, saying no protects you from that loss. and you're afraid you're going to miss out on an opportunity, and so you're more likely to engage to avoid a loss than you are to accomplish a gain. And so it's kind of a double hit at the same time. Now, myself and clients and students have restarted negotiations that there have been extended periods of complete silence from the other side. The thing that you have to know is when you restart that conversation, you cannot go back to the same communication you were using before. You cannot go back to selling. You cannot go back to trying to convince them of your position. Actually, your next move, you absolutely have to get them to say, that's right, to however you follow this up. And what you're going to get them to say that's right to may sound like it's against your perspective. You may say, look, it probably seems like I've been completely unreceptive to anything you've had to say, and it seems like I've been taking advantage of you. Now, those are two very carefully worded statements. You never admitted that you are, but you respected their perspective, that it seems that way, which then encourages them to talk even more.
Do you have off the top of your head a that's right color example that people can kind of really grasp the idea what you're saying, that that's the objective, is to get them to that's right?
There was one of my MBA students is a pharmaceutical saleswoman, and she's got a doctor that's in her territory, if you will, that is not giving her the time of day on their most recent drug that the pharmaceutical company is probably very high profit drug, hot into the market. They're anxious to make it. And while he'll keep appointments with her, he's always multitasking. He's typing on a computer. He's just barely tolerating her. She decides she makes another appointment. She got one objective. She's going to get a that's right out of him. But it's got to be from his perspective and almost against her interests in what she's going to say. So she sits down with him and she says, your patients are more than just patients to you. They're people. You feel responsible for their lives and for their long-term health, and you are not just going to take the latest drug from some pharmaceutical company who's trying to maximize its profits, who doesn't care about your patients, doesn't even know who they are, and doesn't care that they know, and just sees them as possible dollar signs. You're not just going to accept the latest recommendation from a salesperson because your patients are human beings that you feel responsible for their lives. And notice how she puts that. That was almost like she should usher herself out the door with that. She said he turned and looked at her as if he'd never seen her before and said, that's right. He felt, I know from studying this after the fact, he felt connected to her. He felt genuinely and completely understood, and she ends up making the sale as a result.
It just puts in perspective. It's the emotional drivers. Even if we think we're Spock, the Vulcan, we're really not, are we? We're just not. We're a mess of all kinds of stuff.
Right. Hostage negotiators, the edge that we had was like, we never tried to pretend people were rational. So we learned a bunch of tools that were like, okay, they're emotional, they're wired a certain way. And even before I heard about prospect theory as a hostage negotiator, we were always searching for the loss. We knew the loss was the driver. And so give me a set of skills that gets me to that as quickly as possible, establishes rapport, and gets me nearly everything I want without giving up anything in return. People are human. People are human. And give me those skills and let me accept the fact that, we're driven by our passion and purpose in business. What we care about is what we value, and that's how we make decisions based on what we care about. And I can put these in a business context and make deals that other people can't make.
Let me go back in time again a little bit too, because I think this can come forward as well into a business example. I'm just terribly curious. All of the kidnappers that you dealt with, does one come to mind? Of course, look, if you go down the kidnapping direction, you're not really trying to do good, most likely. You're kind of have fallen off the wayside to kind of a bad direction. However, that doesn't say that particular individual is not extremely bright, have good technique, good strategy, very smart. Is there a kidnapper that comes to mind for you that you learned something from them, or am I just digging for something that doesn't exist? Is there a memory of one where you kind of walked away, even though they were just gone the wrong direction in life? You walked away and said, "Wow, that was an interesting experience. I really learned a tremendous amount from that."
I think I learned from everything. I mean, the one that really opened my eyes much more in how every phase of hostage and kidnapping negotiation really drops into business. We got a lone serial killer, lone kidnapper who's a cab driver in the Philippines. I talk about it in the book, and he was the only lone kidnapper that I'd ever heard of. And I know enough about kidnapping that it's kind of, if I haven't heard of it, it might have happened, but it probably didn't. So this was the first guy that I ever heard of, let alone worked. And he was exactly like the guy in a bank robbery that was very manipulative, in that he wouldn't use a singular personal pronoun to save his life. He was like they, them, the rest of the kidnappers, these guys, those guys. He was always laying it off to somebody that wasn't on the phone. He never would say I, me, or my in regards to anything. He would never say I want. Just like the guy in a bank 20 years earlier would never say this is what I want. He kept talking about the other guys that were more dangerous. And this has come to be a known tell in business negotiations. If the guy across the table is always, he won't say what I want. He's talking about what his team wants and what they're going to do or not here. That's the guy. You've got the decision maker at the table, and he's doing his level best to hide his hand. And I can remember this kidnapping in the Philippines. He was so in love with the plural pronouns at the time. I never imagined he was a lone kidnapper, but I thought we were talking to the boss. He was working too hard to make himself seem powerless. The brother of the kidnap victim that I was coaching, he caught on really fast to our coaching. And we were focused on the, what we called then open-ended questions, which were how and what questions. And now we call them calibrated, because they're calibrated for effect. And he got so good at it that, he has the perfect double combination, which was he put when and what together. And he said, when we run out of money paying you, what's going to happen to my brother? And the kidnapper on the other side, he felt so empowered by that question. He wasn't threatened in any way, and he hesitated for a while, and he said, it'll be all right. And the moment I heard that, I said, we got this guy. He just promised never to hurt our hostage, no matter what happened. He just promised. And we did, and at the time, I had no idea the guy was a killer. So to get a killer to promise that, as a result, under his own power, I knew it was a genuine response. They ended up doing a rescue. This guy was so smart that he'd been communicating via email. He thought he disguised his email. It was actually the second rescue attempt. The first one, he had wired his cell phone to the antenna on a roof 3 blocks away from where he really was. And they thought they triangulated his cell phone. They went out and they went on a raid one night. They missed him by so far that he didn't even know there was a raid. And they ended up grabbing this guy. We find out everything about him. We find out about other kidnappings. One of them I knew of, where he cut off the ear of a victim. Another one I didn't know about till we arrested him. He had taken a ransom, and the victim had never surfaced, which means he killed him. And so we were with this extremely shrewd, extremely intelligent killer who was as cold as they come. And we used this stuff on him and figured him out and outmaneuvered him and caught him with it.
It gives hope to about just any situation, doesn't it?
I think it does. I've never claimed that my book will help you make every deal on the planet, but I've always felt like this approach to negotiation leaves you better off every single time. There are some deals that you don't want to make, depending upon the circumstances, but without fail, with this approach, every deal is improved every single time.
I want to dig through a few points that I just think are really interesting. I'd like to hear you elaborate them on this. why questions, how questions, your rule of three, and the difficulty of lying three times. It's just a fascinating, and look, that we could tear this apart all day long and talk about it, but I would love for you to give that kind of top-down overview of what I'm driving at there. I think the audience will find it really interesting and thinking, of course, they need to go dig more and dig into your work, but I think I'd love to hear some from you about it.
All right, the why questions, now that's a strategy. That is a black belt strategy. All right, so why makes people feel defensive? So if I want to know why you did something, and I may need to know why you did it, if I ask you why, it's going to make you defensive, it's going to hurt our relationship. And when I first started teaching in business schools, we used to say, never ask why. And a lot of people improved all of their business communications by just dropping the word why entirely, and instead would say, what made you do that, instead of why did you do that? Instead of why is that a good choice? What makes that a good choice? Change your whys to whats. And then I learned that I could actually take the dynamic, and if I were to say to you, why would you ever switch away from my competitor, and why would you ever come to me? I mean, why would you ever do business with me? And suddenly they defend doing business with you. And in a way where they now begin to articulate what you would have said, but it means more because it's coming out of their mouth. That saves me time because now I've got you defending me. So why is the one strategic use of it that'll help you, and be aware of when it hurts you? How questions are enormously powerful. How questions make people feel large and in charge. People love to be asked how, and you can take a how and construct it in a way where, I've really boxed you in. Like, if I don't get what I want, how are we supposed to make a deal? How am I supposed to give you what I want if I don't at least get a fair exchange out of it? I mean, you're going to feel in charge because I've asked you how, but I've really just put real constraints on how you can answer. And I can also use that to do something that we refer to as forced empathy, which when I say, if you want me to do something I can't do, and I say, how am I supposed to do that? It makes you take a hard look at me, which is the forced empathy. And coaching a client earlier today, with in a negotiation where the other side has all the power on him, personal guarantees, significant amount of money. He's got to re-up on the documents at high rates of interest. They call him to sign again or go to court, and he's got nowhere to go. And he says, how am I supposed to do that? And instead of saying, because you have to, the other side says, so you're telling me you don't have any other options? Which now is a softening of a stance, and it's somebody saying they're open to options, which is a big change from because you have to. So, and that's what happens with the how question. They'll soften some. They'll give you some room someplace. And then, finally, lying three times, nobody will lie exactly the same way three times in a row. They're going to switch it every time. So someone will either stick to their lie and expand on it, which is the Pinocchio effect. If they try harder to convince you, if they throw more words into it, then they're actually giving you room. They're giving you more ammunition. They're giving you more opportunity to see the lie. Or in one instance, somebody asked me, I said I was going to do something that I didn't mean to do. I was loaned a personal compact disc that had a bunch of personal video on it, and there was no harm in me duplicating the video. So I was going to borrow and duplicate it. And they said to me, "You're not going to duplicate the video, are you?" And I go, "No, I'm not going to duplicate it." And then she said to me, "But no, you're really not going to duplicate it, are you?" And I said, "No, I'm not going to duplicate it." The second time I said it, internally I went, "Doggone it, now I said it twice. I can't do it." She got me to promise. Once I could live with not keeping up to my promise, but promising twice, she didn't even have to take me 3 times. I'm the kind of person that if I say I'm going to do something twice, let alone 3 times, you know what? I'm going to do it. You'll get me to do something I don't want to do because I've got enough ego in my own words that if I tell you more than once I'm going to do it, it's going to happen. And that's an interesting way to turn somebody around when they may be hoping to sort of tell you a white lie once, but they won't tell the same white lie twice and then it's no longer a lie.
Chris, never split the difference, negotiating as if your life depended on it. The title of your work. Why the main title? Never split the difference. Why the main title?
Because the first thing anybody learns in a negotiation, and, the guy that you bought that house with, you settled for $900, right? Mm. He probably wanted $900, but he knew, splitting the difference puts him at $850. So all he's got to do is raise his asking price, and then he can say, hey, let's split the difference, and it seems fair. It seems like both sides won. It's a high anchoring effect. A lot of negotiation instruction that just says, just raise your price and ask for more, and you're going to end up where you wanted to be all along.
In my situation, weren't we splitting the difference, though? He said 800, I said $1 million, we settled for 900. Wouldn't that be a definition of splitting the difference, and that worked out good for both sides? Or am I?
Well, both sides tend to be very happy with that, and it's a shortcut. But I know as a seasoned negotiator, if I want more, I just got to raise my offer in one direction or another, and then I move the middle. That's all I'm doing. I mean, there's an old saying that the guy that wants to split the difference with you has a poor judge of distance.
My example is interesting and fun, but it's definitely not textbook.
I get what I want originally by just asking for more.
Right.
When I went through Harvard Law School's negotiation course, in order to ensure that they gave me a slot for free, I asked for 4 slots. I didn't want to put 4 people through there from the FBI. I'd have been happy if they'd have given. I just wanted to guarantee that they gave me what I really wanted, which was 1. So I said, look, they got back to me. They promised me. I said, I got 4 people I want to put through. And they go, oh, we can't do 4. We could do 1. And I went, okay.
It's such a fun conversation because I think we could literally sit down and just go through. Look, it's almost like as I'm listening now, it's like I want to go to class. I want to go. I want to start from the beginning. I mean, I'm kind of having to pick and choose a little bit from your work and stuff, but it makes me really want to sit down because it is. Life is negotiation. Every damn day I'm negotiating 2 book contracts right now, and they make me want to just. And I watch their motivations, and their motivations on some things don't make any sense except they just want to win. Really, I'm looking at major publishers, and some of these line items have no benefit to them at all, but they just want to win because what they want is they've been told that they need to make sure that they protect some right that they might use 5 years from now where they want to have the upper hand on me. And it completely has nothing to do with getting the book that we want to work on right now done.
Yes, right. And they get so emotionally determined on things that don't make sense, right?
But everyone listening can think of these examples in their own life. And I implore people to take a good read of Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It. Christopher Voss. Definitely check it out. Chris, hopefully we can talk again in the future. I think you could tell. I think this is just a really interesting stuff. And your direction and how you got there the non-traditional way. Look, I'm a non-traditional guy. So anybody that comes at hacking the system and gets in through the rear entry and it doesn't come in the front door, but then ends up at the front of the line. Yes. It's all good, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. This was a lot of fun to have this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
I appreciate it. Hopefully we'll talk again soon, sir.
I hope so too. Thank you.
And now for the bonus material that I mentioned in the intro. More great color from Chris Voss. This is a fascinating read. I think for me, immediately you start to just realize, wow, how wrong I am in almost every aspect of negotiation. Look, I've done pretty good in my life, but when you see how you guys have gone ahead and figured out the science and the psychology behind it all, it's quite amazing.
Thanks a lot. I mean, it's a little harsh to say, but I don't want anybody to think that they're wrong. I mean, I think a lot of people succeed really well because they know their business and they're really good at their business, which gives you reason to think you're probably a good negotiator. It's just that you can get better at negotiation. You're probably just better at having to be better at your business.
Let me break this apart to some heavy stuff right off the bat, and we'll come back in examples and backfill, etc. So two of the people that you talk about in your book prominently, and I want you to outline their contribution to the field and then how you have synthesized it. But two people that you talk about in your work have been on my show, Bill Urey and Daniel Kahneman. Why don't you blend in how you have taken from both individuals to put together, and it's not just you alone, but you've been a guy right there at the forefront, how this synthesis of Urey's work and Kahneman's work has led to better negotiation tactic.
The getting to yes stuff with Bill Urey and Roger Fisher, that's the intellectual structure behind negotiation. It makes a lot of sense, and I think it's helpful for people to understand it. I never met anybody that had really dug into negotiation that wasn't impressed by the work of getting the yes, and I also never met anybody who ever said, wow, I cut all these deals because I read Getting to Yes, which is kind of crazy, right? Because the intellectual structure is there. It's helpful to understand. But Danny Kahneman, that's just really how people are, really around how the people are driven by loss and how they perceive loss. And it's not intellectual at all. It's not rational. It's just not. And Kahneman's stuff is so powerful, and loss stings twice as much as an equivalent gain. And people are driven by that loss aversion. Yeah, that's it exactly. So, how do we blend this framework? And then once you blend those two ideas, then the hostage negotiators just give you a set of tools to navigate those ideas. And so that's where I think it really comes in from three areas, because hostage negotiators just understand that people are driven by fears and by loss. And maybe they won't say the word fear, but if you're concerned about something, if something is giving you a little bit of stress, anxiety, that's fear in disguise. And so much of what people do around us is driven by fear that you have to take it into account.
Let's take apart an example. I'm thinking off the top of my head, because I just read this recently and I'd read it years ago. I believe decades back, maybe not that long, Steve Wynn, one of his children was kidnapped. I don't know if it was an international situation. Walk the audience through, and then we'll go ahead and figure out how to explain this from a business perspective, why this is useful. But walk the audience through. Here, perhaps you get the call, and Steve Wynn's child has been kidnapped. Perhaps it's an international terrorist. I mean, you take that phone call, that initial phone call. There's still, even though you've got all this experience, and I want you to explain some of those early steps how you start to build that rapport, but there's still fear on your end. I mean, I just can't imagine putting myself in your shoes and getting that call, and I would immediately be thinking, man, one wrong move, and this kidnap victim might die. You might be the last person to say something to the terrorist or the kidnapper, and they might take action based on what you say. That's a tough position to be in, isn't it?
Yeah, well, once I understood the process, and once I thoroughly understood my adversary in kidnapping, I mean, I got to the point where I did it enough times that, in that line of work, in that business, now on my side, there wasn't fear. Now, the family's scared to death. But I learned how to navigate that stuff too. And the kidnapper is a businessman. The kidnapper, it's a transaction. And he's going to the ATM that he thinks is going to kick out the most money. And he's got a very definite process in mind. And he really doesn't care one way or another. He just wants some money. Once I thoroughly understood kidnapping, and I thoroughly understood that kidnappers were just commodities dealers, I understood what their moves were. And their moves are based about fear and control and intimidation. Then once those are givens, a kidnapper is a relatively easy person to cope with. And it's not one wrong move in any negotiation. It never is. A straw that broke the camel's back really is a series of bad moves. And then in any negotiation, the other side is going to telegraph to you how bad those moves are and how close you are to the end. If it would have been Steve Wynn's child, I know that they want the money more than anything else, and they lust for it, and they can be controlled by that lust. And their lust is also a combination of love and fear, which gets us back into this fear thing again. And they're horrified that they can't get what they lust for. And again, you harness fear in a negotiation, you have the upper hand.
When you get on that call, I mean, they just want to get their best price. And you're trying to just find that mutually beneficial deal.
Well, no, I'm trying to make them feel like they got their best price. That's what I'm after.
Explain that more.
Kidnappers are real good. We had an old saying, when is the kidnapper going to release a victim? When they feel like they got everything they could. And the classic word there is feel. When they feel like they got everything they could. So we put them through a series of paces. They think fear is their weapon, so we tell the family to be afraid. And as soon as we step into the other side's great strength and turn it against them, then it empowers us. Patience no longer is. I never told people to be patient. I said patience is a weapon. And that would immediately transform the exact same set of circumstances to them. They want to get the best price. They want to push you as hard as they can, and they're gonna gauge that on your emotional reaction, like how scared you get, how much you show that fear. And then that combined with some very psychological approaches in bargaining. When you make a raise, and the next raise that you make after that has to be smaller than the one before. And then the next raise after that has to be smaller than the one before that. And you got to use odd numbers. And way numbers hit everybody's brain in every transaction. And pretty soon we make the kidnappers think they've gotten everything they can. And then when they feel like they've gotten everything they can, and they feel like they did the best they could do, then they perform, because you can't sue them afterwards.
I like this perspective from, I guess I don't call it perspective, this lesson that I can immediately see from your work. You get the call, you're taking the call. He says, hey, I want $2 million for Bob. And your first question, the open-ended question, which I think is really clever when one is not trained like you're trained, how do you know that this person is alive? And that open-ended question, it's not only just that particular question, but the open-ended question, and starting that series of open-ended questions. Talk about the benefit there and what you're trying to do.
How is your go-to question? How is an extremely seductive thing to answer? We wanted to take a very deferential approach. And I believe that there's great power in deference. When you're deferential, you can really, really push the other side. You can take passive aggression to a new high if you're deferential. The first time I realized how powerful it was when I heard it happen, when a kidnapper, a drug dealer who had his girlfriend was kidnapped, used it on another kidnapper. And I listened to the whole dynamic in a kidnapping change. And the guy that asked the question got the upper hand. The kidnapper on the other side never knew that was what had just happened. Because when you get asked a how question, you love it. Because people love to be asked how. It makes a person being asked that question feel large and in charge. And there's nothing like getting somebody to drop their guard than making them feel large and in charge. And that's how we would get the upper hand, because it would put the whole burden of the problem on the other side. And they wouldn't know it because they felt like they were in charge.
Not only the how question, but some of your initial process too. Talk about the mirroring, the giving people the vision of what they want to see and giving it right back to them. It's just really fascinating how you have to go about this, because I don't think your background is in psychology or psychiatry, but clearly you have learned on the fly and probably can sit down and talk with most psychologists and psychiatrists and be on the same plane, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I don't like to use the big words that they use, but yeah, I could sit down and have a conversation with them. And they would use the big words that they use to describe the stuff that I do. And I would smile, I could smile and nod at them and say, you're right. And they'd be really happy. They'd feel very good about themselves. They are all the same techniques. I mean, it's getting somebody to talk. It's getting them to let their guard down. It's getting them to feel not the least bit threatened at all, which, is exactly what someone who wants to be in charge feels. And in most bargaining situations, and a kidnapping is a bargaining situation, the person on the other side is trying real hard to feel in charge. So mirroring is another way to get them talking, to keep them going, to make them feel like they have complete control, even when they're terribly insecure and timid and they're concerned about talking. And mirroring is this just magic, just repeat the last 1 to 3 words that they said. And nobody, until they try it, nobody believes that it works. They think it's crazy. If I mirror someone, they're gonna know that you just used a hostage negotiation trick that Chris Voss taught you. How dare you? But they love it.
You've got some great examples in your work positive examples, things that worked out. Let me ask you off the top of your head, though, because I'm sure there's at least one or two situations that you can recall that perhaps did not go right, and perhaps you were right involved with that situation. Can you recall one of those events and perhaps talk about the lesson that ultimately came out of it?
Well, yeah, and the Burnham case in the Philippines, we'd coached the family through negotiation with the kidnappers, and we thought that the kidnappers were going to let them go, and they didn't. And then about a month after the kidnappers took the family's money, there was a botched rescue attempt by the Philippine Scout Rangers, and Martin Burnham was killed by friendly fire, and Deborah Yap, the last Philippine hostage, was killed by friendly fire, and Gracia Burnham was wounded. And I thought we were going to get him out about a month earlier, and we didn't. And then when it got even worse, that not only did they not come out, that, there were 2 out of 3 of our last hostages died. That was a really, professionally, it was a low point. Personally, it was a low point also, although sometimes I think it's a little self-centered of me to talk about how low it was for me when nobody in my family died. I didn't lose a loved one the way that the Burnham family, the way they did. That was a low point, and at the time, we did everything we knew how to do at the time, and it wasn't enough. It was inadequate. I had a lot of help on that case. I had a lot of help on every case I ever worked. And we went back everything that we did and talked about it after the fact, and we just had to get better. There was just, if what we knew wasn't enough, we had to get better. We had to raise the level of our game. If I was going to keep doing it and not let anything like that happen again.
How did you get better?
Well, that was really a combination of a couple of things. I went to, that was when I started getting involved with my friends at Harvard, who weren't my friends yet. Thank God when I went up there and showed them my business card, they were receptive to talking. And we started to collaborate with them and talk about ideas. And in reality, I thought that our techniques were actually more advanced than theirs were at the time. They talked a lot about active listening. A friend of mine up there, Bob Bourdon, at the beginning of one presentation that he gave, he actually said, active listening is a stealth weapon of effective negotiation. So we're on the same sheet of music, but we had evolved it to a much more refined degree. What really made the difference as we were trying to get better was I came to understand the power of the how question, the how, the what question. And what I really did was try to infuse, hard bargaining tactics with what we now refer to as tactical empathy. Actually, when I read Jim Camp's book, Start With No, which really refocused me on a tool that we already had of the open-ended questions, and then I heard the Pittsburgh drug dealer use it in a kidnapping, that's when I realized we had really looked at negotiations where there was hard bargaining as not being an appropriate place for the strategic and tactical use of empathy. We primarily only used empathy in barricaded situations, or when I had that bank robber that I negotiated with at that bank in Brooklyn. That wasn't really bargaining, that was just straight empathy, because I didn't want to bargain in any meaningful way. I just wanted to hit him hard with these emotional intelligence tactics and get him to give up and come out, which he did. But it never really occurred to me what would happen if you were just really kind of, very aggressively use empathy with aggressive bargaining techniques. And when we threw the two of those together, then we found we had something ridiculously powerful. And we gained such a huge advantage in our hard bargaining techniques when we pushed, I know it sounds crazy, but assertive empathy. I mean, weapons grade empathy. Tactical empathy.
Give me an example. Paint a picture for me really quick.
I used empathy when I bought my truck. My Salsa Red Pearl Toyota 4Runner that I'm in love with. Which is saying what's on the other guy's mind. And so I knew that the car salesman was going to tell me it was a beautiful truck, that it was worth $36,000, that I was in love with the truck, because I was clearly in love with the truck. And so I said it first. I said, this is a beautiful truck. And especially if you can say things that seem to be against your interest, that seem to favor the other side. You set them up. How am I supposed to do that is the knockout punch question when you set it up with tactical empathy. So I said, the truck's beautiful. It's fantastic. I feel bad offering you anything less than $36,000 for this truck is probably worth more than $36,000. The Blue Book is high. It's in fantastic shape and I love it. But how am I supposed to do that? How am I supposed to pay that? And when you articulate everything that they say, you take away everything they have to say. And especially then if you follow it up with, this incredible, brutal, deferential question, 95 times out of 100, they crumble. So why do you need, I don't need to deal with those 95 situations that I could have solved with this approach. I only need to make a substantive counteroffer in a small percentage of the times that a substantive counteroffer is actually required.
And that is right about the time that Chris lost his voice on our first conversation. I hope to have Chris on many more times in the years to come. His book, Never Split the Difference, Negotiating as If Your Life Depended on It, is on Amazon. Grab a copy. His website, the Black Swan Group, blackswanltd.com. Check it out. A really fun conversation, and I feel lucky every day to do this podcast and keep learning from all these super, super smart people. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, Trend Following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.